right. And so the question at heart here was, why don't you spend more time on certain components or certain concepts within cybersecurity? Why spend so much time on one over another? And there's a lot of answers to this question. But one of the core things to keep in mind is whoever designs the course that you're taking or the person you're listening to, they have, from their experience and expert opinion, developed what they think is the most optimum path for you to proceed forward. And depending on what they're trying to teach you, that means they're going to emphasize and overemphasize certain concepts in comparison to others. For example, if this was more of a technical know-how kind of class, we would do many more functional things, and I'd spend a lot less time lecturing and talking. But I find that kicking somebody into functional things right out of the gate turns them into a relatively quick, functional cybersecurity professional who has giant gaps in their education, and then 3 years from now regrets the fact that they didn't get the proper foundation. In Kung Fu, we say that in Kung Fu, there's a reason why we put somebody at least 6 months on just learning the basic foundational positions that you need to be in, because without that foundational work, nothing that you build on top of it is worthwhile. It's like building on top of sand instead of pouring a solid foundation. The same thing applies to cybersecurity. Part of the reason I've spent now 3 slide decks on concluding today on DNS is because it is one of the most crucial components of your job. I think I mentioned before, you'll spend half your time looking at DNS at a minimum in some fashion. And I will add on to that one key thought. And anybody can answer, all you can answer, doesn't really matter. If you think about it, if I'm in Texas and my attacker is in Minnesota, and they're not physically going to come to me to attack my network, how are they going to get to me?
Through the internet.
Through the internet, which is through the DNS system, the domain name system.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to have to use that. And if that's going to be the pathway, and really, if you think about it, they either come physically to you or they come logically to you, i.e. through the internet. There's only 2 paths. Once I can rule out one, I've kind of got one place to focus now. And that makes things a little easier, both logically and in where you need to put assets to defend what is yours. So keep that in mind. That's part of the reason why I bring up and emphasize so much of DNS in the beginning is if you understand DNS very well, later on when we start talking about how you can find artifacts in specific areas and how those artifacts can signal patterns of behavior that tell us what's going on, it isn't black magic that's happening, right? It's not, hoodoo or this arcane thing that's occurring. It's simple analysis tied to patterns of behavior and likely courses of action that your adversary will take. Okay. Now, for the thing I wanted to bring up, there were comments that were sent to me privately, and I think publicly. I'd have to go look at the comment queue, but there was a few things that were asking me why I chose what I chose in the first couple of slide decks for an entry person into this field. And part of my answer is what I already explained, that as an instructor, I want to emphasize very certain concepts in the beginning. I take for granted that people know that there's an internet, right? I don't think anybody in the class today doesn't know that an internet exists. And that, I assume also that they know how to put a name in a browser and can follow that to a location, and they know how to navigate and browse, open email. So I don't cover those things because they are at a user level very familiar. Now, as we progress on, I will show you what's happening behind the scenes, and we'll continue to look at and emphasize how those actions leave a trail of artifacts that expose behaviors that we can go use to figure out what's going on, both from the user perspective and someone who might be in the middle or observing or attacking. So there's a comment there that I wanted to address. And since this is being recorded, I'll encourage them to send another comment if they don't like that answer, and I'll happily respond to it. Okay, now that that's done, let's get into the slide deck. I have only a few slides today and hopefully a fair amount of conversation between us to go through it. Who's ready?
Ready.
Ready.
Right. Okay, so we're on slide deck number 4. We're going to go deeper yet into DNS a little bit. Won't spend any time on this slide at all, other than to say that this is, again, kind of an apprentice level, so very much introductory, explaining very broad strokes, very high level topics, but starting to get down a little farther than those big strategic chunks that we talked about before. So previous to this, we spent some time talking about how IPs are structured, the big masses they belong to called asynchronous systems, and how those ASs have their own numbering system and how they work together using kind of this universal protocol called Border Gateway Protocol to know how to talk to each other and kind of pass packets of data around. We're going to move a little closer to home and kind of talk about a more like close to your network or inside your network situation. So if you look at my image here, you'll see that it shows the shadowy outline of a laptop, and someone has, I'm going to move my mouse here, typed a URL for example.com and hit enter in their browser. Now, if you follow the red arrow, you'll see that that action is going to spawn a second action where the browser's DNS cache is going to come into being. So remember, domain name system is how you turn what you type in your browser into a number that equates to a server that has content that you want to see. And so it's going to look and see, have you been there before? And it's going to look locally in your browser in this little place called cache. And a cache is just a handy list of things that you've kind of seen before. Now, if it isn't there in your browser's cache, it's going to go to your computer's DNS cache next. And this process happens regardless of what operating system you're on. So if you're on a desktop system, at a minimum, it's going to check those areas. It's going to look in your browser, and then it's going to look on your computer. And each computer kind of does it a little differently as far as the operating system type, Windows versus Linux versus Mac, but they all have a similar system, which means if you're thinking like I am as an analyst, those are actions that are going to spawn what?
Artifacts.
They're going to create artifacts. So at a minimum, when someone puts a URL in the browser, they've already created at least 2 artifacts at a minimum, and processes have fired off very quickly, mind you, but they've fired off. If they don't get the answer in these 2 locations, the next thing that happens is it leaves your computer and it's going to go to the router. Now, if you're part of an enterprise, there'll be more things in between potentially. There might be a proxy, for example, that's in place. And what does a proxy do in general? What is a proxy? I mean, what's the definition of a proxy?
It replaces you. It might say that you're, instead of where you are, coming from somewhere else, like
Sure.
Europe or.
At the heart of things, a proxy kind of replaces you in some capacity. So it's acting on your behalf. So if I want to buy a security, or I want to buy a stock online, I usually don't do it myself, right? I may go through a system and that person's going to act as a proxy for me using my money to go buy something. Or if you use Instacart, when you give them an order, they are a proxy for you to go buy groceries at the grocery store and bring it to you. The concept is the same. In a network, it's very common, especially in an organized enterprise or a company, for there to be a special computer called a proxy, and its job is to go to the internet for you. And I want you to keep that in mind because we're going to talk about that in a little bit. And if there was a proxy, it would be right here on the other side of this example. But in this case, in my diagram, we're more of a home network. I wasn't ready for that. Come back here. And there's a router. Now, your router is your connection to the internet. And if you recall the previous slide deck where we talked about ASNs and who owned those, to get an IP in somebody's ASN, you have to buy access. And as a home user, we go to our local internet provider and we're like, hey, I'd like to be able to get on the internet. And what do? They ship us a router. I don't think anybody's in a different situation. You're probably not surprised to find out that businesses have the same thing happen. They buy a router. If they're big enough to own their own AS, they provide their own router for themselves. But everybody has this connection to the internet. And I'm going to click this now because this comprises kind of your network, if you will. If this is your home, that's your home router. This is everything that's happening inside your network when you try to go somewhere on the internet. These things are going to happen and create a trail of artifacts. So as a question, do you think there's an artifact left on your home router if you're going to the internet for a website?
Yes.
Very much so. And depending on the router type, it can be a significant amount of data. I'm going to show you a few pictures of what you can see on a home router as an example. So not even the big mega routers and the really cool stuff that we use in enterprises. We're just talking about what you can see at home. And I'll encourage you to do that on your own router. Now over here, once we hit the router has no idea where this address is. All it knows is you typed example.com, browser didn't know where it's at, computer didn't know where it's at. It hits the router and router's like, I need to ask somebody. So the first thing it does is, hey, ISP provider, do you know who this is? And it's going to say, nope. And then it's going to go up here and it's going to say, oh, that was a .com. So let me go talk to the .com top level domain. Let me talk to that big root server and say, hey, do you know who this is? And it's going to go, no, I have no idea. And it's going to, but now I know who to tell you. Sorry, I know who to refer you to. And you're going to go down this chain. And I only have one little block here, but this is a chain of resolution for it to find out what IP matches that domain you typed in. And this, depending on how complicated it is, could be handed off dozens or hundreds of times before it starts to get an answer. And then it returns back the way it came with this green arrow strat, this green arrow that returns it back. And you'll see it returns back the same way it came. And then it's going to go to your router. It's going to go to your computer cache. It's going to go to your browser cache. And then it's going to go to you. And then you're going to get a connection to that server that has the content you asked for. Now, I hope as analysts that you're thinking about all the places the artifacts probably just showed up. And you might be going, like I did when I first realized this, greedily going, washing my hands, going, look at all the places I can go look. Look at all the artifacts that tell us what's going on. You wouldn't be wrong. However, a lot of times you don't have insight into this resolution chain. In fact, many times you don't have resolution past your network or by the or through the content that was provided to you. And so you kind of lose visibility there unless you have an over the horizon service of some kind, which we'll touch on here in a minute. And secondly, these are the records that are created in the resolution chain are very ephemeral, which means they are ethereal, they vanish very rapidly because those are very busy servers and they only keep a small cache locally and then they get rid of it. Now I say that, but at the same time, there are companies who pay very large amounts to buy that from them so that they have it instead. And many of those companies are what we consider an over the horizon service that provides information past the barrier, past the outer wall of your own network. So I'm going to pause. Questions so far?
No questions.
Too easy. All right, let's talk about the next one then. Same thing. I already kind of brought up artifacts, but I want to reemphasize something. No matter what, you have to go through the router. And I want you to remember that. And I'm going to say these other statements and I'm going to talk about why that's really important. So you can use another protocol. You can go through a different port. You can even build something on the fly or use some kind of pre-built software. But no matter what, you still have to go through the router. Now, why is that so? Why do I have to use the router? What does it constitute for me in my network?
It's like it's the connection to the outside.
Right, it gets you to the internet, right? So if the router's gone, can you get to the internet?
Nope.
No. You know, even if I'm a piece of malware and I write my own entire DNS stack and protocol, and I can rebuild TCP/IP, which is the protocols we use to, you move across the internet and use DNS. I rebuild my own. I still can't get to the internet without a way to access it. And the router provides that part. So when you hear or you see diagrams, especially in our field later on, when you're looking at security reports and they're like, oh, the attacker got on the network and then they went around all the security protections, they still had to go through the router. Really, really important to keep in mind, because it becomes what we call a choke point. Not to get too military on you, but if you played wargaming or play games in general that have any kind of fighting component, if you can control the ground and you can control the path and squeeze it down until there's only one path, that becomes a choke point. Place where you can stop, where everything kind of narrows down so there's only one option. Now, in a bigger network, you generally have multiple routers at play. But no matter what, if somebody, attacker or somebody that's supposed to be in that network, wants to leave the network and go to the internet, they have to go through an internet connection, typically a router. There are some variances to what can be done there, but no matter what, something routes. So if you have a MiFi or a hotspot, it is a tiny little router. It connects you to a cellular network and it routes for you, therefore meeting the definition of a router. If you use your phone and you tether something to it, your phone then becomes the router. Because what does it do? It accepts a connection and it reroutes it to the proper place on the internet, therefore meeting the definition of a router. Because a router is what gets you to the internet. It's what moves data packets. Now, you can read all the statements. I'm not going to read them off, but I want to say some key things here and get you to think about them. If the router is critical, obviously you want to watch it, right? You want to make sure that it's secure, that no one can beat it up, change it, modify it. So those are things that are important. They're generally, there's a panel for every monitor and there's a way to access it that lets you see information. And I'm going to give you some snippets of that here in a bit. And even if you use your phone to perform the same thing, you know, it's performing as a router. Now, in an enterprise, like at home, you don't care. You don't have anything other than your router in most cases, unless you have a more complicated network than the typical user. But if you're in a company, they have a proxy server and they have their own routers and they configure computers that are on their network to use those. You must use my proxy. You must go through my router. And one of the things a security team will do is there a computer on my network that is not using my proxy, right? Because you want to make sure that everyone follows the prescribed paths so that you can monitor it. And so if you see internet traffic hit your router that did not go through your proxy, for example, you might want to go figure out what's going on there, because that's an indication of someone not following the policy that you set forth, which is there to protect you. Does that make sense so far?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Which is why the proxy is there. If the proxy is going to go to the internet on your behalf, then it's really important, because on the proxy, so first off, let me back up a second. Routers get really, really busy. Like
They're handling
busy.
everything, right?
Yeah, they have a simple function, but holy crap, do they get overwhelmed, right? Just doing that simple function. And their job is to get you to the internet, basically move, you know, connect you that way. That's all they have time to do. When you add more on them, they slow down and or break. So generally speaking, there's a way that you put security on either side of your router to protect it. And you put security on either side of it to do things that would otherwise cause a slowdown with the routing part. Now, there are exceptions to everything. Just keep that in mind. But generally speaking, you don't dump a bunch of things on your router because you want it to do one thing really, really well.
Let it do its job.
Let it do its job, indeed. And so that proxy is frequently where you go, I'm going to put what we call speed bump in place. So if you try to go somewhere I don't think is good, I'm going to throw a page up and say, hey, are you sure you want to go there? Do you know you're leaving our site? That's what they call speed bump, and it happens at the proxy. And so one of the things you can do is past the router or on the router, if you see activity that is going around your proxy, you flag it and you go investigate it to figure out why. If you look at a lot of security reporting, and I hope you will dig into some of it as you go and see the wide variety that's out there, you'll see that frequently the key thing that tipped them off that there was negative activity happening was that they saw something in internet traffic, or they saw something that was out of place, either by its behavior or the timing. One of those three things tends to happen. And generally speaking, it deals with the internet, one way or the other. Now, keep in mind that bottom bullet before I move on. As long as there's an IP address somewhere, this router can talk to it, which is how you can lure it into doing things it shouldn't do. All right. Let's talk about what a router sees, unless there's questions on what I said before.
No, that all makes sense.
Might have some at the end.
Yeah, that's fine. So, but key to this point, you have to go through a router to get to the internet. It's going to happen. Now I'm going to go, before I move on to all these, think about what I said about you tether your phone to your device, you tether a device to your phone, and now your phone's being that routing. At that point, you've bypassed the enterprise network and you've bypassed my proxy in the situation I was describing. So you could get around things. The problem that you have to be careful of, if you're the bad guy doing that or the person trying to get around things, is if you're connected to both my network and you're connected to your phone simultaneously, right? You have two Wi-Fi adapters, or you have a Ethernet connection and that, or some mix of the two, you will give yourself away into security tools if you're not careful. Because think about it, if we're looking for it, you just created a pattern of behavior. You're doing your things, you drop off, something happens, you come back maybe, but there's a drop off of activity. And then maybe I see a malicious action or something. It just depends on how you can piece things together. But especially when you come back online to my network and I query what you have been doing, if you remember that previous, let me go back a few here. You remember this diagram right here where it says browser DNS cache and computer DNS cache? Even if you replaced my corporate router, I'm pointing at it, but it doesn't help you guys. It's awesome. Even if you replace this corporate router with your phone, what artifacts get left? This one and this one. And you also deliver content, which will also get cached here on this computer. And so a good security team will be looking for things like that. And will fingerprint that's your home router, in the sense that, okay, you went home and during an evening time, you were connected to a router. This is why I said time is often an out of place event that we look for. But during the middle of your workday, when you should have been working, all of a sudden you're tethered to your phone and you're leaving records here. That tells me behaviorally there's something going on that probably shouldn't be happening. You see where I'm going? We're going to get really deep into this later when we talk the frameworks. This is part of behavioral analysis that's really important, especially if you're a defensive kind of analyst in this world. Let me move back forward. So what does a router see? Now, I bolded IP address because the most primitive router sees your IP. And most home routers and stuff will do at least that much. And many of them will see more though, much more. They'll get connected devices, usually by what we call a MAC address, which I'm not going to try to break out what that means, but that's just a alphanumeric sequence that identifies a piece of hardware in your computer. Unfortunately, it can be changed at will. So it's not necessarily a very good way to identify things, but it is there. Timestamps of activity, sources of activity, and to a certain extent, your browsing history. A good router, even a home one, will tell browsing history. But there's a but there on purpose. Because if you use a HTTP connection, all right, so quick side left step, HTTP stands for what? Anybody?
Hyper something text trans something protocol. Hold on.
Hypertext transfer protocol.
Yeah.
And so if I add an S to that, then what does it become besides HTTPS?
Secure.
Well, that's the idea. Definitely. So that little S, when we add it on there, is an indication that we're doing something to the transfer of data, because HTTP by itself is considered insecure because it's basically plain text. It's easy to intercept. It's easy to read. There's no protections there. And so if you're browsing to something that is an HTTP site or content, it is visible to most routers. So if you go to Starbucks and you pull up an HTTP version of a page, Starbucks will be able to see where you went because it knows it by a device and your IP it gave you and the IP of what you went to, and to a certain extent, your URL if you typed it and content that came back. But if you did that with an HTTPS, a secure connection, that would be encrypted. And unless it has a decoder, which they're very expensive and it won't, they're not going to understand what came back. They'll just see that you type something in, you connect it to an IP, and then it'll blank out after that. That's kind of the point, to obscure what's going on for your safety and for your security, and because it's not necessary for them to see that. And that equation that I just rattled off, expectation of privacy, is what that really kind of breaks down to, changes when you're in an environment where that goes away. That's why many places will put you consent to monitoring by going past this point to let you know that they're going to see everything you do. The government is very good at this. They'll put a consent to monitoring on any of their sites because they're going to record you from that point. But what I want you to understand is all of that kind of boils down to text, lines of text put inside of a file, specifically a log file, an log file, which is just a type of text format. And what does that look like? Well, let's see. Now, this is a Wireshark view of something from a home router. This is a few years old because I purposely picked something that was not my home and was from somewhere else and is a little bit out of date, so nobody gets in trouble. But this is an example of what a home router would see of someone's activity. And so the simplest way to read this is if you follow the first line, so find number 343, it's the leftmost column under NO, under number, and you'll see it gives a time, which can be converted. And then it gives a source. Now that IP address there, that 192.168.0.21 is the IP address that is a home IP address. When we dig a little bit deeper in the next slide deck, I'm going to talk about how certain parts of the IPv4 range, which is version 4 of your IP address assignment, and same thing for version 6, has certain ranges that are considered home only or residential. And they're kind of benign. You'll never see them outside of the home environment. And you'll see some that are kind of locked down for other specific reasons. And that's important because they will never be natively on the internet in a way that we should see. But that's for later. So source is kind of where it started. Let's say its origin. Destination is where it's going. And then it tells you the protocol. And we haven't touched too deeply on that, but there are different protocols and each one requires kind of a certain formatting to its data. Keep it simple. And then in the info is kind of what happened. If you're seeing this for the first time, this can be a lot to take in, but you can play around with this. There's a tool called Wireshark. You can look it up. You can download it for free. It allows you to take snapshots of your own home traffic if you like from a computer or on your router if you point it there. And you can kind of dig through line by line what happened in a transaction. It's one of the things in our functional nights that we're going to start covering. But to focus in on what's going on here, as I mentioned, IP address present, sources of data or connected devices kind of present. I'll show you in the next picture how that really gets rendered. Timestamps, you can see timestamps. They just need to be converted, and sources of activity and where they went. So you can see here, this is where this person went. I don't know if you can see this part about Netflix. That's where I uploaded it from. In case you want to go there and look at it yourself in site. You see they got a 302 and then it redirected. So when I say they can kind of see your traffic, this is what they see. And this part down here, this frame, and this content down at the bottom down here is actually what was transferred from that location. I don't want to talk too much about these because they deserve their own slide, their own night. more than anything else. So I'll leave it at that, but you can see quite a bit as far as being able to trace and track someone's activity. Same thing for, this is actually a Wi-Fi history view dump as well, different date. And you can see the same thing where on the left there, the event time, this is when it happened. Here's the kind of connection. So connected, network associated, whatnot. You can see this is a wireless kind of connection. This interface GUID is just a number, that's convenience number that talks about the interface. This local MAC is that MAC number I was talking about, and it identifies the device. So you see there that 10FEED, that's kind of the nomenclature. It goes on for a couple more. Then you get program name, SSID. I think everybody here is connected to Wi-Fi, so you know what that means. And then so on. There's other data that can go on, including the level of protection that's in place. In this case, WPA2 personal in most cases, or this one that's completely wide open. That's horrible. So you can see a lot. And this is just at home. Think about what you can see in a corporate environment. It gets even much more diverse. In fact, applied to our job, there's our poor router. See, I noted it was a critical asset. It's very single-minded. It's easy to overtax. The internet's on the right, and most of our classic answers to security here is, hey, let's get a firewall whose sole job is to stop traffic that shouldn't come to. And you can have a firewall on either side of a router. It can be in front of it and on the other side of it, and frequently is. The MFA stands for multi-factor authentication. So not just one thing allows you to get into a location, but you need more than one, say 2 or 3 or so on. A filtering rule says, hey, I'm going to let traffic in, but I'm also going to filter that. And so I'm going to filter out some things that I don't want. Behavioral analysis, of course, and then of course, agents is the last one. That's a security tool that's placed at it in some partner network to do a specific function. Collect data, stop bad things from happening. Antivirus would be an example of an agent. We have something called endpoint defense and response. So that's another one. An EDR tool. Plenty of things. Plenty of things. Now, one thing I didn't put on here, the one that I liked, is cyber intelligence. It's another component. It goes both left and right of that router. So more traditional cyber int focuses on the inside of a network, everything inside the perimeter, if you will, everything on the other, the router side, if you will. And then in cyber intelligence that looks over the horizon, looks past your perimeter, looks at the broader internet, at those things I talked about, BGP, ASs, where that IP is coming from, how it got to you, those kind of interactions, it looks there. I'm going to pause because it's a lot and see if you have questions. Oh my goodness, no questions. My job is done. Okay, we're ending early tonight.
You just kind of answered it, because I was holding on to this whole time, but it was like the application of all of this information that you're giving us is in the field in a broader sense, but specifically for cyber intelligence. We look at more than just this, but the router is the choke point between the bigger over the horizon stuff and the inside network.
Absolutely. The router's one of the first choke points. And then the second choke point is generally the name server, which is the next piece. Let me back up in slides here. This part here, recursive DNS server. It's also called a name server. It's one of the first stages. So past the router, it goes with the name and the router's IP and says, hey, do you know who this is? Those servers are generally called a name server because their job is to match the name you typed in to an IP address. And they don't always know. But if your ISP's name server or the name server defined for your enterprise knows it, caches it, right, keeps it locally, then it may respond to an answer and not go through the whole resolution chain. That would be awesome. That's why we cache in the first place.
And then also catching somebody here, say that there is somebody specifically targeting my network, right? I'm a company or whatever.
Mhm.
they're going to leave a trail from where they started to where they want to end up, which is inside of my networks.
Yes.
That trail is probably going to be difficult to catch, and difficult to like not long for this world, right? Like,
Correct on both. I mean, so to see that trail, you have to have an over the horizon service of some kind. There's no other way to do it. If you
okay,
don't have a service that lets you get insight outside of your perimeter, outside of your network, you'll never see them coming. You'll never see them leaving. Right. And you don't know where they went after they exited. Right. You lose that insight. So essentially, if you think of it in, well, can you imagine having a battle where you had no idea where the enemy was? And if you can't physically, if you can't like immediately see them, they're totally invisible to you, right? They can flank you, move around, attack you from the backside, step away, and like, haha, you can't see me. And then, dance around to the side and hit you on the other side. And like, that's how people tend to look at cybersecurity and defense.
Mhm.
They miss that crucial component of you need something that gives you a sentry, that gives you visibility beyond what you can just see.
Okay.
That's why traditional security kind of failed in that it tried to build layers of defense around the network, but it never paid attention to the fact that the attacker's advantage is they get to choose the time, the place, and the weapons of the battle.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They come in with like, hey, I found a vulnerability in Firefox. Cool, I'm going to use that. Okay, I've chosen the weapons. All right, the field is going to be, and they're going to target a certain structure of that company, and then they're going to pick the time and they're going to hit them. Friday at 4:30, when everybody's going home, boom, I'm coming in. Why?
Cruel.
Because you don't want to deal with anything. And there's a good chance you ignore stuff until Monday because it's human nature. So they understand some psychology. They chose the ground, they chose the weapons, they chose the time, right? And we're not paying attention. And if you have no sentries that look past kind of your network, you're even more not only blind, but completely blind.
And there's a lot that you can do. Well, there's only so much, but you're saying that the focus has been on trying to anticipate those, say, vulnerabilities, attack vectors, all of those different things, and build defenses to prevent them. But they're just limitless. Every day there's new ways to get into a system.
Sure.
Every day there's a new vulnerability.
So let's talk about that. It seems limitless, and I'm going to use the word seems, but that's why I keep bringing up choke points and course of action. And we haven't delved too deeply, but I'm going to talk a little bit about it right now. Every day, you're right, there are new vulnerabilities, dozens sometimes multiple dozens in one day, and they're across the spectrum. And so you're touching a little bit on one of the key things that every good intelligence team learns to do is to figure out what is a threat and what is not. And it's more than just, do I have this device in my network? That's just the very beginning, because something that's not in your network can be a threat to you. You have to learn to nominate a threat and then evaluate it and potentially continue to evaluate it over time to see if it's truly a risk or a threat. But secondly, even though there might be 20 vulnerabilities tomorrow morning, at a certain point, they all come down to the fact that they may not even be applicable to your situation, but they're going to cause a lot of noise. For example, you could have a virtual software. I'm not going to name names. You have some kind of virtual software that you use to load, virtual machines in your environment, and you have, say, half your network virtualized because you're trying to save money, and it's actually a very good way to protect it in some instances. And you see vulnerabilities for it come out, and everyone's on fire because it gives what they call RICE or RCE, so remote execution capability. And like somebody somewhere in the world could just saunter into your network and come in and automatically be an admin. That's generally how these spill out. And you'll note that if you look, this is why I encourage you, don't listen to me necessarily, just go do your own investigation, but look at the last, say, 100, 200, 300 vulnerabilities that come out, and look at how many of them where somebody says, this is kind of important, but you're okay. They generally say, holy shit, you're on fire, and you're going to die tomorrow if you don't do something, because they need to get your attention. Now, part of that's we have shortest attention span as humans, but partially it's if they don't jump up and down and tell you it's the end of the world and an apocalypse is going to happen, you won't make a change. That's more psychology, and security vendors know it well because they're the primary people that come up with these. And researchers have jumped right on board that are independent, because unless they jump up and down, you won't listen. So everything has to be the end of the world. So there's that. That's why I said you have to have a good process of evaluation and nomination and evaluation. Is that a threat? Let's evaluate it. Nope. You have to wait. You have to have some kind of, as unbiased as possible, specific to your environment way to do that. And we'll actually talk about how that works. I'll give you a working model for it at some point in the slides. Not today, obviously, but later on we have more understanding, but you need that. Now, here's the other thing that's very important to remember. So 30, let's say 50 vulnerabilities come out tomorrow, and we're all jumping up and down. Each one is the end of the world and an apocalypse on its own. It's got all kinds of different names, from Ragnarok to you name it. You pick your apocalypse name. Part of the reason that happens is because of the psychology, like I said, but equally, every one of those people producing the vulnerabilities and talking about them has kind of falls in one of two buckets. One, they're trying to sell something. And if they're trying to sell something, they have to make sure it's worth it for you to pay for it. And you should always keep this in mind. From a independent researcher to a research company or a security company that's doing research, they have something for you to buy. And they have to make sure you have a reason to buy it. And so they will pitch the way they write what they're talking about in a way that supports that. And that should make complete sense to everyone, because they're a company, they're a for-profit company in most instances, and they have an incentive to do so. But that skews the conversation right off the bat, because you do not get an unbiased view. And it could be both financially, politically, and otherwise influenced. And as a good analyst, we need to keep bias and keeping bias out of our analysis forefront in our minds. So you need to ingest that when you see that someone's screaming up and down about one of those 50 vulnerabilities, and you look at the fact that it's in your environment. You're like, I have this, it is true. There does seem to be, and then you kind of go down your checklist. Is there an open proof of concept where someone has tested this and proved that it can happen? Oh, yes. Okay. Check. Now my score for evaluation is rising to nominate this as a threat. Is it something that could actually occur in my network? No. Okay. Why? They presuppose, and you list all the conditions, preconditions for that to function. You're like, none of those absolutely at all work in even the most naive situation you could create. Then you would say, no, this is not a threat. You would log it, of course, and then move on. If it changed to yeses, then it would change, right? You have a simplified manner of figuring something out. So back to my point I was trying to make. Sorry, I got off on a tangent. It's like one of our frustrations. Security vendors have something to sell you. Everything's always the end of the world. And the reality is there's really only a small number of things that are going to go wrong. And there's really only a very small number of ways in which you're going to get compromised. That's the truth, but that does not sell products for companies.
Right.
It does not sway your boss to invest in security tools.
So you got to kind of stride the line, right? Like, yes, of course, it's the end of the world. Now give me funding so that I can get tools to fix it. But at the same time, you do have to understand that not all of these are going to be the end of the world. You have to have a system in place.
That's why you have to evaluate. You have to have a nomination and evaluation process. And it's usually connected to math. You have a scoring system so that you have an unbiased, and hopefully everybody buys into process. That's the best way to do this from a defensive standpoint in an enterprise. You have a process to go, I think this is a threat. Here's my scoring on why I thought so. You talk it out. And if everybody doesn't agree with you, then it's not a threat. If they were wrong, then you get to poke them in the eye. You have a process of reevaluation in that sense. Then it's kind of cyclic. Or you may have something you go, oh my goodness, we actually are on fire. And then, the next day you find out you're not. I mean, all intelligence is ambiguous to a certain extent, and you have to accept that or get out of the intelligence business, right? There are no definitives. There's no 100% ever anywhere. It's impossible. So, but you get as close as you can in a structured way that's repeatable, that I can do again and again and again, and somebody else could repeat in my place, right? And that's a sustainable, repeatable process that you should always strive for. Now, the part about what I said, there's only a few paths. That's the truth of this. It's the unpleasant truth, but part of the reason I said, you remember the router is everything has to flow through the router. And a very common response, a naive response in many cases, but a very common response in really critical situations in like an incident where someone's attacking you actively. It's not like you see in Hollywood where you have like fingers flying across keyboards and all this other magic. Frequently, they just go turn the damn router off. Because right then, this internet connection got severed. And if someone was stealing your data and uploading it right then, it stopped. Now, that doesn't solve the fact that you might have malware or something bad happening in your network, but I've solved the problem of somebody's trying to escape with it. Now, at that point, depending on what's going on, you take your next steps. If it's a destructive action, i.e. ransomware or something equivalent, your response has to change, right? You may have to move more timely than you would if it's a non-destructive situation. That's for a different talk about incidents and how they kind of work. But that's what I mean about there are some simplified things. If you know, this is where it gets uncomfortable. So we struggle as humanity between convenience and security. And you can look in your own life and see the proof of that. Right? We all like to get email. Well, maybe, but we all like to have communication with our fellow people out there. And you get emails as part of it. We all want to be able to click on links, see pictures, look at the funny, videos that come through, whether we're following a link or seeing them right there in our browser or on our desktop. But that convenience also kills us from a security perspective, right? Each one of those could be a malicious link. Videos could have something they shouldn't have in it. They could drop files, right? And the easier we make that, the easier it is for the attackers to get in and infect us because we're opening the door for them. And so you could say, well, you could completely restrict that and have a very effective solution and not get infected, but nobody would stay at your company because they'd be miserable. And companies know that. So they try to straddle the middle line, as you mentioned earlier, and they try to find a way of securing just enough, but not allowing everything. And I always personally instruct that the right response is the parental response. Every response to my child growing up was yes, but. Yes, you can do that, but let's do it in a safe way. Yes, you can go swimming, but you're 2.5 foot tall and you don't know how to swim. So let's start in a kiddie pool that's only 6 inches deep. You can splash in the water and be totally happy. And when you're ready to move on from that, I have taught you some safety measures and maybe how to swim. Right? So it was still a yes. Instead of no, you can't get in the water. It's a yes. Maybe we graduated you up. In security, you need to have the same kind of response. Yes, you can have access to all those files that you want that are coming from a dirty, completely malware-filled place, but let's put a few things in the way. Let's isolate everything and make sure it's clean before we hand it off to you. And oh, by the way, if your computer starts firing off with malicious activity or really suspicious things, we're going to pull you offline gently and tell you, yeah, you can get back on the network, but we're going to clean that first. And that changing that narrative is kind of part of our core components. If you recall the very first slide deck, I said there are certain components that we have as part of our job. And part of that is not only advice, but also education. And this is part of our job to educate. And I want to make sure I completely covered the fact that there really is only a few ways that you have a problem. You're going to have a problem with your internet. You're going to have a problem with files. You're going to have a problem with your file system, or you're going to have a problem with your network. It doesn't get much more difficult than that. And every one of them has an easy fix as long as you don't care about people being disgruntled. Because the safest company is the one that has no internet connected to it, but you're not very happy, right? And they're not either, because that's what we rely on. So many of those are unrealistic, naive kind of responses, but you need to consider them, because if you don't at least consider them first, you don't know that they're not the right move yet. That goes back to what we call course of action analysis, where you look at all the possibilities. And so if I can look at all the possibilities, this laptop that I have on the screen could get compromised. I can then isolate out the ones that are most likely and the ones that are least likely. And I can change my time accordingly. A laptop that never leaves an office, that always stays connected to my network and is pretty much protected by my security tools and gets very little interaction is probably a low risk because of all those things I just said. But a laptop that goes home, that goes to conferences, travels across the world, and is on and off my network and attached to cafes and coffee shops across the world is an incredibly high risk. It is promiscuous, as we say. And that becomes problematic.
Yeah, because you can have all of the security set up at your own space that you want, but you can't guarantee anybody else to put the proper amount of security on their door to the internet.
So this is part of our task in the education and advisory portion of our job, not only to respond to threats and look at all those 50 vulnerabilities and everything, but to go, there's 50 vulnerabilities, but only one of them might apply to us. And here's why. I graded the other 49 and they didn't even come close to being nominated. Here's the one that did. That's part of our task. That's simplifying that window, because it's our job to actually look at all 50. It's the CISO, security manager, security, whoever, is in a leadership position that is, have we talked about stakeholders yet? Informed, educated, practitioner type stakeholders. We touched on that.
Yeah, we touched on that in the beginning of this one.
Okay. Yeah. So you have folks that are informed, they have to know about it, but they're not part of the security process. Then you have educated ones that are part of it and they're decision makers, and they absolutely need to have more information, and it needs to be structured a little differently. And then you have practitioners like us who actually do the work. And don't think that just because we do the work that we're in a better position. It's just that we see the information differently than they do. We need to make more tactical, operational kind of decisions, right? Things that are in the mud, like we're in the mud, we're fighting hand to hand in that kind of combat. That's the person that's up top orchestrating 50 of us or 100 of us or 1,000 of us, right? They're in a different position. They need different information. It's always important to keep that in mind. One is not better than the other.
Makes sense.
Yeah, they're just in a different position. We all have different information needs. Forgot where I was going, darn it. So you have these different stakeholders. You need to actually update them in different ways. Part of our education process is simplifying. So those 50 vulnerabilities that we're talking about, it's our job to look at all those and nominate the one that matters with an agreed set of parameters that say this is why these can matter and these are why these other ones don't. And then next week, when they're like, pull one of the 49 out of their hat all of a sudden and surprise you with it, you're like, we talked about this, right? It's that kind of discussion. We had an agreement. Well, I don't like your agreement. Well, that's not my agreement. It's the process. Let's change it if you don't like it, right? And then, that's a key thing I'll tell you later, and I'll just say now, never make it about you and always make it about a process. My process said the procedure we wrote did, right? Always anonymize, not always separate it from you. That way it's not your opinion, because it gets personal then. And you need to do the same thing for them. It's like, no, it's not that you said this is important or you said this wasn't important. It's, we graded it together. We agreed that this did not meet parameters. If that's not true, we can go and re-examine that to make sure we're actually grading correctly. And you should do that anyway, but it helps make the process less painful. It also means that IT won't hate you. Because if your IT department, if your information technology department is adversarial to you, you have a very hard time.
Yeah, that doesn't sound pleasant.
Because they're the ones who take the action. And by getting them to buy into a nomination and grading process, they become more confident that anything you bring to them makes sense that they should take an action on versus what seems kind of arbitrary.
Does make sense.
Yeah, frequently I've heard them go, you just read that in the news. And I wouldn't blame them. I've heard a lot of people actually do that crap. They just take what's in the news and say, you need to do all these things, even if they're not realistic.
A team member, we want to be a team member.
I got an audio alert. What's up with that? Okay, it came back. Okay. That was odd. Yeah, so it's important. Our job is to simplify. And so, but back to that, I don't feel like I've answered this part about, there really is only a couple of areas. That's why I was trying to talk about the internet, the router. I mean, there's a key thing. Your access to the internet is a core area. At a simplified level, that is like the choke point. If that's not present, the attacker from somewhere else, even if they're next door, can't get in unless they physically come over.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you can interdict i.e. stop, or you can do filtering and prevention at that point, either in front of it or behind it, you're at your best location. And this speaks to where you position your tools. But usually engineers get into this part, and we're not really talking engineering so much, but it's important to us because as a person who has been a defensive analyst and an offensive analyst and a researcher, but having dealt with incident response frequently, probably the biggest sad thing I find is that security tools are present and it makes me happy, but they're all in the wrong places, which makes me sad. They're not watching the right locations. So they don't have good observation on that core choke point. Right? They've segmented or split off their network and put another router internal to their network. That's what segmentation really is. But then they don't watch it. So they don't know if it's doing the right thing. Right. So that's what I mean about that. That's the part that's really cool. They have the tools, but sad that they don't really have them deployed well. But back to simplified things. If you tell me there's a vulnerability out tomorrow and you're like, we're on fire, and I agree, there's a POC, people are exploiting it, and we're like, holy crap. But the device I have, it has zero access to the internet and zero chances of it getting to it. My urgency to actually prioritize it as a problem goes way down, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Because you take away the core pathway. So yes, it could have hit all the parameters for like the worst vulnerability and exploitation threat possible.
It's the end of the world.
But because of the way my defensive structure is set, it's not. It's down at the very bottom. And the core part of that is building trust with your leaders and being able to prove that. If someone says, nope, we're on fire, I need you to fire everybody up or stand over the weekend, and you go, not a problem. We don't need to do that. Here's why. And after you've done that a few times with them and been right, as much as you can, you will find that they will start agreeing with you. Because you build that trust up, that there's a process and that you're giving them correct information. But it always begins with, you have to have a good nomination and evaluation process and a complete agreement, as much as, well, I won't say complete, but good agreement amongst all your teams. Because the realism is, it isn't nice like it is laid on paper. You're not going to have like 2 or 3 teams talking all nicely to each other and, oh, it's so awesome. No, they're all going to be fighting and squabbling, and there's going to be 11 teams, and they're all going to be doing 11 different things, and 4 of them are going to do the same thing. They just think they're different. And you're going to have that kind of structure in an enterprise. You have to get them all to agree that, nope, this is what happens. Priority 1, priority 2, priority 4. And here's our nomination process. And we all agreed to this, and we scored at X, right? And it just kind of goes on. That will be your biggest good fight that you can have in an intelligence, as an intelligence entity analyst at an organization.
Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
No questions. I'm excited to get behind the wheel and see kind of what these things look like, more of how again, like how to find those artifacts, the pathways. So yeah, I want to get behind the wheel, but everything is being explained really well.
I appreciate that. We will get to the frameworks and stuff. They're a little bit down the line. I may move a few things forward and kind of do a framework or 2 of analysis so that we close DNS well, and then move into systems and networks, because each one has a slightly different, but the kind of the same kind of analysis path. And there's a few rules of thumb. I'll throw out your direction. I know somebody on the call knows a bunch of them, but one of them is, actions lead to artifacts. It's kind of an easy one. If you see an action, it will leave an artifact. That goes back to Locard's principle. Every time you enter a scene, digitally or physically, you leave something behind, you take something away. In the cyber realm, you create a record or you leave a record, right? And you take something with you. Happens every time. Whether you can find it or see it is only the question. I mean, how many detective shows have you seen where they find the one blood droplet or something that was hidden in a place they didn't know at first, but when they found it, it like blew the case open.
Right.
It does actually happen. And kind of exactly that way, sadly, but it does occur. All right, I'm going to turn off the recording.